Now, I never had the privilege of meeting my great-grandfather, but I can't help but think how proud he would be to have so many people partnering with him to educate the next generation about history, civil rights, the presidency, and our American democracy. And I'm especially proud that we're celebrating his civil rights legacy this evening. As the first president to address the NAACP on June 29th, 1947, my great-grandfather said, "It is my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in the long history of our country's effort to guarantee freedom and equality to all our citizens." His efforts and the efforts of those who followed in his footsteps have been moving our country closer to that freedom and equality that he advocated for, even though it's been an arduous path over the last century. Tonight's keynote speaker has had a front row seat in the civil rights movement from the 1960s to now. His recent book, Jackson 1964, tells these insider stories, including an unforgettable plane ride conversation between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a young white man sitting across the aisle, during which Dr. King said, "I'd like to be loved by everyone, but we can't always wait for love." But not only can we share in his unique historical perspective, he's also had us reeling over the years through his witty writing in The New Yorker on all aspects of American life, with a special focus on food and travel. Of course, here in Kansas City, we're proud to claim him as a local boy and a longtime evangelist for Kansas City barbecue. I had my first last night. I went to Q39. Oh my God. He even interviewed my great-grandfather. He called the Kansas City president for his college newspaper. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage journalist, renowned author, and Southwest High School class of '53 graduate, Calvin Trillin.
Thank you, Wesley. It's nice to be home. In the 70s, when New York was going through a sort of a rough patch, I would come home and my high school friends would say, "How can you live in New York? It's crime-ridden, it's dirty, it's crowded." And I said, "There are no chiggers in New York." They said, "Not even in the tall grass?" I said, "There isn't any tall grass." Of course, if you live in New York and you're from Kansas City, you stand in danger of having somebody say after you tell them that, "I guess everything's up to date there." They think they're the first person who's ever said that. My late friend Pat Ullman, who some of you knew, I'm sure, dealt with that in an interesting way. He refused to acknowledge he had ever heard of a song called "Everything's Up to Date" in Kansas City. They'd say, "Everything's up to date. I guess everything's up to date there." And he'd say, "Well, it's a progressive town, but no more than most, I think." They'd say, "No, the song." He'd say, "Song?" And they'd say, "Oklahoma." I said, No, Kansas City's in Missouri. A lot of people think it's in Kansas. I never heard of anybody who thought it was in Oklahoma. Sometimes when somebody says to me that he's from Kansas City, I say, "Well, I don't mean to doubt you, but a lot of people who aren't from Kansas City claim to be from Kansas City just for the prestige." So I'm a Kansas City booster in my own way. I've had some problems with the real boosters of the Chamber of Commerce during the Glamour City period, and that was also in the 70s when they adopted the motto, "More boulevards than Paris, more fountains than Rome." And I wrote, from the safety of New York, I wrote, "There's so many more fountains than Rome, they could dismantle some of them and build a monument to Henry Perry, who brought barbecue to Kansas City. I had to explain what I meant at a Chamber of Commerce dinner that I spoke at. I said, it depended on how many more fountains than Rome we had. I didn't want to lose the edge. I didn't want to go to Rome someday and find a sign that says Più Fontane che Kansas City. On the plane yesterday, I read an interesting column in the Washington Post, written by David Ignatius, because it mentioned Harry Truman, more than mentioned him, described him. It said about his virtues, it said, quiet leadership, fidelity to his belief, a disdain for braggadocio. He never took credit for things he hadn't accomplished. He never blamed others for his mistakes. Ignatius said that what used to be called manly virtues, I think of them as Midwestern virtues, and particularly Kansas City virtues, of course. And I still value them as what I call a resident out-of-towner in New York. I wrote a book about my father once, and I suggested that if you listen to people talk about their childhoods, you can detect a theme. Sometimes it's, we come from a noble family and you must never besmirch its name. Sometimes it's, we're miserable because your father deserted us. Or something. And when I have two daughters who grew up in Greenwich Village, and when I realized that people had themes for their childhoods, I tried to wonder what I wanted the theme of my daughter's childhood to be, and it was, despite all evidence to the contrary, you're being raised in Kansas City. One of the Midwestern values, virtues that Harry Truman had was a lack of self-importance. And that's very Midwestern. I once tried to suggest license plates for mottos for states that didn't have them, and I tried to keep it Midwestern, so Nebraska, I thought, a long way across. The Arkansas one was a little wordy, but I was going to cut it down. It's not as bad as you might have imagined. And I thought if there was a motto for, if there are regional license plates, there was a motto for the Midwest region, the motto would be, no big deal. Ignatius also referred to Harry Truman as a low-key Missouri farm boy. He forgot to say also a failed haberdasher. Although I was a boy when Harry Truman became president, and it seemed to me that every adult that I heard talk said he had bought a necktie from Harry Truman at 12th and Baltimore, wherever that place was. I think that if everybody who said that really had bought a necktie, we would be here celebrating not a former president of the United States, but the necktie king of the tri-state area. I was particularly interested, I was once given a 1944 phone book. And the reason I was given the phone book was that on one page, the left-hand side of one page, it said, my father in his address, Abe Trillin, 601 West 70th Terrace. And on the other facing page, it said, Harry Truman, 219 North Delaware, Independence. It's a Midwestern thought that you're not so important that you can't have your name in the phone book with everybody else. If you do, somebody might come up to your mother at the market and say the thing that every Midwestern boy dreads, Harry's getting too big for his britches. When I actually interviewed him, as you heard, I was a freshman in the paper, and it was very easily arranged. I didn't come from a family of any political influence or anything. And he was then, it was before the library, and he was at, I guess, was the Federal Reserve Building. And in my memory, and I may be wrong about this, he just had one of those offices that looked like maybe an accountant's office that said Harry Truman on a frosted glass. And there was a secretary who went in, and either she said, "Go right in," or he waved me back. And we had an interview, and I wrote a story for my college paper, and it was actually a terrible story. And it was very stiff, and it didn't describe anything that was the atmosphere of the place, but it was as if he had come to give a foreign policy speech or something. And then I walked with him to a dental appointment, and everybody said, "Hi, Mr. Truman." He said, wave. And he said, "Be sure to send me this story." So with some trepidation, I sent him the story, and he wrote back and he said, "Dear Calvin, thank you for sending me the article. It was perfectly all right." Oh, I forgot to tell you, plain-spokenness is another virtue. When I was growing up here, race was considered, your views on race were connected to your geography, so that it was assumed that a white person from the South was a white supremacist, although it was also assumed that that was a perhaps regrettable but not disabling characteristic, sort of like boasting among Texans. I remember, as an example, when Jackie Robinson broke into baseball, it was some of the sports writers wrote that he would have trouble with one team because the manager was from Louisiana. It was just assumed that the man was a racist because he was from Louisiana. And of course, if you were in the South, it was assumed that people who weren't from the South were your enemy, outside agitators and reporting in the South. The question you were asked if you were stopped by a deputy sheriff because you hadn't stopped quite long enough at a stop sign, even if you'd gotten out of the car and kicked the tires and got back in. The question was always, "Where are you from?" And I work out of the Atlanta Bureau was not considered an adequate response. They say, "Where are you really from?" I always said I was from Kansas City. I think Missouri would have been better. The best thing to say, I think, was, "Oh, I'm from up around Jackson County, Missouri." I didn't have the nerve to use that. But in Kansas City, when I was growing up, it was, in fact, essentially a segregated city. Without any rhetoric or signs. There were no drinking fountain signs or people giving speeches about how God meant the races to be separate. A lot of things were just taken for granted. It was taken for granted that white theaters were for white people and restaurants were for white people. It was a white-run restaurant. The exception, of course, the glorious waiver, was barbecue, because black people ran barbecue in Kansas City at that time. I always said that in those days, going to a white barbecue restaurant was like going to a Gentile internist. Things might turn out all right, but you're not playing the percentages. And around that time, I was the city auditor of Kansas City. It was 1953. Not the real city auditor, fortunately, because my math is not strong. I was never able to persuade my mathematics teachers that many of my answers were meant ironically. But I was city auditor at high school day in City Hall. Um, uh, the mayor was Melba Zachary from Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, in those days, we would have called that a colored school, and there was also a Lincoln Theater where African Americans went to the movies, and a couple of other businesses. They're in my 44 phone book around that neighborhood. I always thought it was possible for a kid who didn't pay much attention in class to be surprised when he learned that Lincoln was actually the name of a president. That he thought it just meant colored people allowed here. But it was taken for granted that she went to Lincoln and I went to, this was 53, a year before the Supreme Court decision. It was taken for granted that she went to Lincoln and I went to Southwest, and when we got through spending the day learning about democracy, she would go back to her school and I would go back to mine. At least taken for granted by me. I can't speak for Melba Zachary. And I spent a year in the South as a reporter, regularly being asked where I was from. My headquarters were in Atlanta. Atlanta was chosen partly for the airport. They used to say in the South, if you die, you might go to heaven, but you'd have to change planes in Atlanta. And I happened to be there in a busy year with school desegregations of New Orleans and Atlanta, sit-in movements in Atlanta and Nashville, University of Georgia desegregation, the Freedom Rides, and I got so that I thought I knew quite a bit what was going on. I could calibrate somebody's racial views by how he pronounced the word Negro. I knew all the verses to We Shall Overcome. I knew enough about the Klan to tell a klaxon from a Kleagle from a Clavern. My expense account had items on it like pants torn in racial dispute, or after prayer meeting snack Tuskegee 375. And at the same time, the lunch boycott, the boycott of the downtown stores was going on in Atlanta. The lunch counters were closed. And there was a mass meeting every Sunday, so I would be in church every Sunday usually. In fact, I held what I called the Martin Luther King Extended Metaphor Contest. It was named after him because he would have won every time. I always thought that the Southern politicians who were then passing laws that didn't mention race but somehow got into race, if it hadn't been for the First Amendment, could have passed a law prohibiting metaphors. And because the black preachers always said things like, coming out of the long, dark night of segregation into the bright morning of emancipation. And the politicians, the white politicians, used similes. Just as happy as a Thanksgiving, as a turkey on the day after Thanksgiving. They were simile lovers. I was interested partly in the South of how much segregation had warped the entire society. Mississippi, for instance, was called in a notable book at the time, The Closed Society. They had something called the State Sovereignty Commission that spied on people in Mississippi, all in the name of segregation. And they did some vicious and nasty things, but I sort of was interested in the kind of Keystone Cop aspect of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. When I went through their papers, there was a letter handwritten on lined paper of people who said their daughter was dating a guy in Mississippi Southern, and they had reason to believe he might be partly black. They wrote this to the governor, and the governor sent an investigator. And I love the situation in Grenada, Mississippi, where there was a baby, single woman had a baby, and the rumor was the baby was part black. So they sent an inspector there, and he took the sheriff with him. And I can envision them kind of peering over the crib to see what the baby looked like. And finally, in the report, it said they decided to look at the baby's fingernails. There was a belief, it was actually fairly rampant at Hale Cook School when we were about third grade, that you could tell that somebody had black ancestry if he had little half moons on his cuticles, or he didn't have. I can't remember which way it went. Of course, at the same time, this was during the war, we believed Japanese had yellow bloods, and we were only 8 or 9 years old. These were adults. The fingernails of the baby were too small to get a good reading on it. And the woman saw an opening, and she saw that she would maybe get away with it, and she said the father was Italian. I always felt I was being sort of watched in Mississippi, and when I go file my copy, I used to, depending on what sort of the state I was, part of the state I was in, I'd go to New Orleans or to Memphis, and I'd call my office and I said, I've slipped over the border. But before I went there, I did all kinds of preparation the reporters do. I read W.J. Cash on The Mind of the South and C. Van Woodward on The Strange History of Jim Crow, and I thought I understood a lot of what was going on after a while. And then there came an incident that made me realize I really hadn't understood anything at all. This was when, after Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes had been admitted to the University of Georgia, Hamilton lived off campus. Charlene insisted on living in a dormitory, and they gave her a private room, and a lot of hostile co-eds were in the building. And we used to talk occasionally on the phone. We're still friends today. And we were talking about a speech she had given in Savannah, and I said, how was the trip? And she said, it was terrible. And I said, well, I heard that was a very good train. The Nancy Hanks goes from Savannah up to Atlanta. And she said, well, you know, not where we have to sit. And I forgot all about C. Van Woodward and Plessy versus Ferguson, and it all drained away, and I thought, they can't make her sit back there. It's personal. And for black people in the South, it was personal every day, and it still is. I heard a black comedian on television the other day say, being black in the United States is exhausting. And it doesn't end necessarily with success and personal reputation. I love the story about John Hope Franklin, who was one of the great historians of his era, the professor of the James Duke Professor of History at Duke, and the first African-American president of the American Historical Society, recipient of the Presidential Freedom Medal of Freedom. And he was a tall, elegant man who wore dark suit and a white shirt and a tie. And when he was in his 70s, he was waiting in a lobby in Oklahoma City to meet someone. And a young man, I guess a traveling salesman or something, dropped a bag in front of him and said, take this to room 1035. And John Hope Franklin, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, James Duke, Professor Emeritus at Duke University, said, I'm retired. I was asked a lot after the book came out, a collection of race pieces I'd written over the years, if there was any progress. In some ways, obviously there was. When I went to the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides in Jackson, the mayor and the police chief were both African American. But in some ways, it's sort of the same story. There's a story in the book about a black radical who was accused of giving away one marijuana cigarette to an undercover officer and was sentenced to 30 years. The question of unjust terms of imprisonment for minor crimes is a big issue now. And there's some times, of course, when what used to be obvious violent racism comes out in a different way. I mean, the people are no longer have their house burned down if they want to vote. They just ask for voter ID if they have an ID that shows that they can vote. And some movements like the birther movement. I thought Bernie Sanders summed up the birther movement very well. He said, Barack Obama's father was born in Kenya. My father was born in Poland. Nobody ever demanded to see my birth certificate. And school desegregation peaked in 1988. So we're now sort of back where we were in a way, just as when Melba Zachary was mayor and I was city auditor, and she went to Lincoln and I went to Southwest. I'd like to say before I close how honored I am to be here in this event honoring John Lewis and Jim Clyburn, people who have refused always to take things for granted. I just met I just met Congressman Clyburn tonight, but as you heard, John Lewis and I go way back to the bad old days. Our most dramatic meeting was at the Montgomery bus station parking lot when the Freedom Riders arrived from Birmingham. And John Lewis was there among the Freedom Riders. I was there with several other reporters. Some white men with clubs were there, and no policemen were there. So they drove the reporters out before they turned on the Freedom Ride. And I think of that when I hear it said that the press is the enemy of the people, or the press is not to be taken seriously. I found in the South, and I think there are examples all over, when people don't want the press there, it's because they're doing something they're ashamed of. John Lewis is officially representing the people of the 5th District of Georgia, but I've always considered him as representing my conscience in the Congress, and I'm grateful for that representation. Thank you.
Mr. Trillin. On behalf of the Truman Library Institute, I want to thank you for your comments, for gracing us tonight with your presence, for your commentary on a challenging time in our nation's history. And this particular gift is representative of one of Harry Truman's most famous quotes. We thought it would be an appropriate motto for a no-nonsense journalist and author as yourself.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. And from the shape of it, it looks like a necktie.
In closing this evening, I want to thank all of you for joining us for an unforgettable evening in supporting President Truman's legacy in the library and independence. Just a special note to Kim Rausch, our Director of Development, for her efforts in making this evening a success. For those of you, as you leave, there are copies of Calvin Trillin's most recent book, Jackson, 1964, and he has graciously agreed to autograph those for you. So good night, drive safely, and thank you very much.